And there we go. And I will light our chalice. I'll light this chalice in gratitude for all that we've been, all that we are, and all that we will be, both as a faith tradition, a local community, and as individuals. And thank you for being here. My last sort of housekeeping, other than I'm looking around the room, I don't think we need to go very deep into sort of covenant. We all know when we're talking to each other, I think, how to interact as a beloved community, living up to our values. Um, the last housekeeping thing, though, is that this is the first time I'm running this on a new MacBook. And so I think I know where all the things look like they're in the same place, but the mouse pad has a little bit of a different feel. So if something goes awry, I hope you will give me some grace as I figure out the new buttons. I will, with that, share the screen and play it. If you can't see parts of that at any point, you may want to shift your view around. There's not much I can do to keep people off um, if they're blocking your screen. So I'm going to talk a lot about UU theology. And our individual identity as a congregation, but also our bigger identity as UUs. But a few sort of disclaimers. One is this is a really, really, really big brush, so much so that you may even want to call it a paint roller approach. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritties. Um, we won't be, so hold on, I'm just going to mute everybody. I think, there we go. Um, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty, very broad brush. We could talk about any one of these topics, any one of these slides we're going to talk about, we could talk about for an entire hour and a half if we wanted to. So it's a big overview, sort of a taster platter, if you will. Also, I am not a historian per se. I am an elementary school teacher by trade before I was director of Lifespan Faith Formation. And like an elementary teacher, I sort of feel like I am a jack of all trades. And so this is part of what I do. I really enjoyed putting this together, this presentation. It was intended for our new members. I gave it to our parents group a few months ago, maybe 2 months ago, and both of those groups, and to our staff, and all of those groups really they really engaged with it well and seemed to respond well to it. So I thought this was something we could all engage with. So with that, we'll start by thinking about what is the theology of our history. So when we think about Unitarian Universalism, where did we start? Um, we're a Protestant religion. We are also a uniquely American religion. We are a religion that started from two separate religions in the colonial era, and sometimes we tell the story as starting in Romania. Sometimes we tell the story as starting, um, elsewhere in the world. The Unitarian Universalism that we practice in the U.S., our sort of brand of Unitarian Universalism, is really a uniquely American thing in the 17 and 1800s. There are other traditions, other Unitarian traditions that sort of evolved simultaneously in different parts of the world. And I would say that the Romanian branch, and the Eastern European branches of Unitarianism are sort of parallel branches. They're not really connected to us in terms of our evolution. Unlike other Protestant traditions like Anglicanism, or any of those sort of Calvinism, any of those Lutheranism, those traditions came across from Europe to the New World, and sort of took root in the Americas. Our brands or our flavor of Unitarian Universalism, Unitarianism and Universalism are uniquely American things. They sprung up here in America. So let's take a look at the two pieces of our name first, sort of our Unitarian history and our Universalist history. And the names, I think, tell us a lot about what these two religions, which were, as I said, initially separate, believed. So Unitarianism is called that because it emphasized the unity of God. So if you think about the traditional Christian belief in God, there's the Trinity, right? Traditionally, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Well, Unitarianism rejects that idea that God is in three parts and is still, especially early on, very much Christian. It doesn't sort of throw Christianity away, it just understands the relationship between Jesus or Christ and God the Father and the Holy Spirit differently than other Christian traditions do, and certainly differently from the way the Roman Catholic Church does with their much more complex theology of the Trinity. And there are different groups of Unitarians throughout the country, sort of believing different things. They weren't necessarily united, despite the name, until in 1819. They didn't quite unite, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with the name William Ellery Channing. Gave the Baltimore Sermon, which was in Baltimore, as you might guess, at First Unitarian there. It was at an ordination, and his sermon really became the theological platform, the sort of go-to document for what do Unitarians believe, and it became the theology that the Unitarians of the time sort of rallied around and accepted as their own. So this is a brief overview of Channing's sermon, sort of the points that he hits. So first, he sets up in the first section of his sermon this idea that reason is a necessary tool for interpreting Scripture. And as you may know, that was not necessarily a common belief at the time. Many traditions thought that one did not need to apply one's logical thinking to Scripture. You just needed to read it and accept it, you know, sort of whole hog, no questioning. Everything was literal. You don't have to think about what it means. You just have to read it and believe it. And some traditions would say that you don't even have to read it. You can just come to church and let the priests or ministers tell you what it says. So there are some traditions that require very little. I don't mean to suggest that they were unintelligent, but they did not necessarily think that critical thinking was a skill necessary to engage with Scripture. It was a matter of faith. So Channing sets up right from the get-go, reason is important, and we are going to be critical thinkers. And then he applies that critical thinking to the understanding of mostly Jesus and his relation to the Trinity. And he makes five major points. First is that God is a unity. So he rejects outright the belief in the Trinity, that God is somehow divided into three parts, that God is a unity. And that's where the name comes from, Unitarian. Initially, it was a slur. The other religious leaders talked about, oh, those Unitarians. And Channing sort of embraces the name in much the way the queer community has embraced the word queer. It started out as a derogatory term, as a slander, and the Unitarians pick it up and run with it and say, yes, we are Unitarians. Second point that Channing makes is that Jesus is fully human. So there's this branch of theology within Christianity called Christology, which examines the nature of Jesus, like who did Jesus think he was, who is Jesus actually? And Channing is saying that Jesus is fully human. He is not some like demigod. He is not some person of the Trinity. He's just a guy. Thirdly, he said that God is morally perfect, and therefore the idea of original sin and hell and this idea of an elect, a select few who are chosen, doesn't seem to make sense. Because if humanity is somehow sinful by its nature, or some people are damned while others are saved, that would suggest that God is sort of has a that God has created something imperfect, that God sort of messed up in what he was creating, intended one thing and it went sideways. And if God is morally perfect, says Channing, it can't follow that his creation would be imperfect. Um, he also says that Jesus, this fourth point, Jesus' death is not an atonement for sin, And that sort of follows from the previous point. If there's no fall, there's no need for redemption. If there's no original sin, we don't need atonement from that original sin because the system sort of falls apart once you start pulling at the strings. And so he sees Jesus as a moral example leading us to personal repentance, for maybe the things we've done wrong in our lifetime, but not this spiritual atonement in some mystical level. Um, you know, it's not separate from anything that we've done, our sinfulness. Certainly, we are capable of sinning in Channing's eyes, but that's through our own choice, not through our nature. What he does say then about Christian virtue is that it's rooted in the moral nature of conscience, sorry, of us just as humans, and that it is defined by the love of God in moral living. So all that's to say, sort of a what would Jesus do approach to morality, that we have it within us to determine what is right and wrong. It's built into our conscience. That Jiminy Cricket, if you will, on Pinocchio's shoulder saying what's right and what's wrong. We have that little voice inside of us, and um, that capacity is innate in us, and that reflects back to where he started, right? That if our reason is sufficient to apply to Scripture and figure out how to read Scripture, then it would also follow that our sort of rational part, our conscience, our moral rational part, would be able to figure out what's right or wrong also. And he emphasizes that that's defined by the love of God. So again, that like what would Jesus do kind of approach to morality. That if we ask ourselves in any situation, what's the loving thing to do? We should know that without necessarily having to look it up in scripture somewhere and find out what an authority told us about that thing. So that's Channing and following him, the Unitarians of the time. Again, this is the early 1800s. 1819 is the sermon. If you're going to GA this summer, it is in Baltimore, and the conference is just a short walk from First Unitarian in Baltimore, where you can see, and if they let you stand in the Channing pulpit, which is still there. I have been behind it. I have sung from that sanctuary, and done some readings from that pulpit. So as I hope you saw in all that, there was a lot of talk about Jesus and God, and probably more than we would hear in our church, certainly at First UU in San Diego. And so you see that these are still people who would consider themselves Christians in the broadest sense, but they're starting to question some of the beliefs that have been traditionally um, just sort of inseparable from Christianity. So that's the Unitarians, and they're going along. We're going to switch over, sort of jump the tracks a little bit, to the Universalists, second part of our name. And just as Unitarianism referred to the unity of God, the name Universalist refers to a belief in universal salvation, meaning no hell. Everybody is saved. And so the Universalists are really it's from the Universalist tradition, I'll say it this way, that we really get this emphasis of love at the center. God is not a punishing God. Everyone is saved, or even more broadly, there's really no need for salvation. So some big names in the Universalist tradition of this time, the sort of the front runners back then, Hosea Bayou, who you may have heard. He rejects belief that human nature is fallen, so he gets rid of the doctrine of original sin, and also throws out with that this idea that was common in Protestantism of the time, that there's an elect or a saved and a damned. Um, there's no separate classes of human beings, like the Calvinists would have believed. A few things I think that Bayou says that are just, I find beautiful. He says that we have a God-given right to be happy. I just find that charming. That it's our right to be happy. And maybe unsurprisingly, he also insists that God is love. Keep in mind, this is in the 1800s. So, it sounds so commonplace now to say God is love. But maybe not so common if you think some of his contemporaries were like Jonathan Edwards, who gives that famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," where he compares God to this sort of person dangling a spider over the fire by the web. Like that was the common Calvinist approach to humanity and God at the time, and this is completely the opposite of that. Bayou also says that, and this I love this phrase, theology is not a speculative art. It's about human experience. So, as we sometimes say, theologians are fond of sitting around and arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, and these kind of really esoteric, not really verifiable, not even close to scientific kind of questions. And Bayou says, no, we're not going to waste our time on that kind of like you can't prove it and who really cares argument. Theology should be about the work of figuring out things that really matter to humans and our day-to-day experience. We ought never argue, this is him, I'm quoting him, we ought never argue over religious matters of truth, which we have no knowledge of by experience. So he's very experiential, which back when we officially had sources is our first source, and still in our tradition have sources. Also, you see here in the picture Olympia Brown in 1863. She is the first woman ordained in a Christian tradition, and the Universalists are the ones to do it. Um, she's a minister, a suffragist, and she's actually one of the only first generation, or not the only, but one of few first generation suffragists who live long enough to be able to vote once the 19th Amendment is passed. And so we have a proud tradition in Universalism of being really on the forefront of women's rights and actually a lot of social justice things, despite many things that um, I think many things in our tradition that we can look at skeptically, and a lot of things that we would not be so proud of looking back, but there are definitely things there to celebrate. So that's where Unitarianism and Universalism start. When we get to maybe the mid 1800s, a little before the mid 1800s, the 1830s, we get this new branch of Unitarianism, particularly, that comes along called Transcendentalism. Anybody ever heard? I can't hear you or see you, but I'm sure you've heard of the Transcendentalists. Um, uh, I took a history course at Star King for part of my credentialing, and the professor said that the Transcendentalists are probably the Unitarians with the best PR firm. Of all of the different traditions of Unitarianism or Universalism, the Transcendentalists really are well known, even beyond the UU world, right? I can suspect that many of us read either Emerson or probably Thoreau in high school or college. Most people don't get through the American education system without encountering these people. So, I don't think I need to go into a lot of detail of them, but just to skim the surface, 1832, Ralph Waldo Emerson resigns his position as Unitarian minister at the Sacred Church of Boston because he decided he didn't want to give communion anymore. He thought it was a ritual that lacked meaning, and so he resigned. And then in 1836, he writes his essay Nature, which introduces the principles of transcendentalism to the world. And he becomes sort of the father of transcendentalism. He believed that the search for truth should start with contemplating the individual self and nature, and believe that truth can be found within the individual, and that the individual and nature sort of contain the supreme source of truth. So I will say of all of these people, but while we're on Emerson, we claim them as universal or Unitarians, but all of them at some point resigned from their congregations. So I don't know if they at the end of their lives would have called themselves Unitarians. They are all very anti-authoritarian. They're not too fond of formal churches and congregations. They all end up walking away from that. But the roots are there, I think. Thoreau, 1854, writes that masterwork, Walden. Um, he moves to Walden Pond and sort of communes with nature. He gets the reputation of being this rugged individualist. I think we imagine him alone in the forest and communing with the birds and the squirrels. More recently, we want to remember that there were an army of mostly women, doing his laundry, cooking his food, making it possible for this man to go live in the woods, quote unquote, by himself, and have this transcendental experience. Not to diminish his writing or what he did, but we'll talk later on about we have this reputation in the UU world, from a lot of it from this period, of being rugged individualists. The emphasis is on the individual to interact with themselves and nature and sort of figure it out. And I think it's important to remember that not even Thoreau, the pinnacle of figuring it out by yourself in the woods, really figured it out by himself in the woods. He needed community to support that experience. And then Margaret Fuller, who, for a lot of reasons, mostly patriarchy, we maybe do not know as much as Emerson or Thoreau, but she is a fascinating person, just a fascinating person in her own right. She's part of the New England Transcendentalist movement, and believes, as the others do, that creation is a unity, that humanity is good, and really emphasizes the importance of insight over logic and experience. So this has sort of a mystical nature to it, this transcendentalism. It is not devoid of reason, and they're certainly not rejecting reason, but they are really giving more emphasis, I think, to the emotional, um, or as the word she might use is the insight, that sort of, well, for lack of a better word, transcendental experience of the world, rather than just the rationality. She's also a huge suffragist, stands up for women's rights very early on. She's the first woman to edit the Transcendentalist literary magazine called The Dial. She's the first woman to be granted reading privileges at Harvard College. She was the first woman to serve as a foreign reporter for an American newspaper. She's a teacher, she's a journalist, she's a literary critic. She hosts a series of, she calls them conversations for women in Boston from 1839 to 1844. These were like, yeah, salon kind of theology conversations, where they talk about big ideas. And she also advocates for reform in prisons. She visits Sing Sing prison in 1844 to interview women prisoners and write articles about them. So, these are the highlights of our past. During this transcendental movement, other Unitarians and Universalists are also becoming familiar with Eastern traditions. So they read texts like the Bhagavad Gita. Buddhism starts to become more mainstream in the United States, and from the early 1800s to this mid 1800 point, certainly through the Civil War, they move farther and farther away from what we would consider Christian. So there's this, um, gradual blossoming of other ideas, and also a gradual, I think of it as a pruning away. So, like in a garden, some things blossom and then the gardener has to cut away other pieces. That's what's happening in both of these traditions. Some ideas are leading us down another path, and then as we go down that path, we're cutting away things that we say, oh, this Trinity idea, that doesn't make sense anymore. Oh, this hell idea, that doesn't make sense anymore. Maybe we don't need a priest. So throughout that process, we march into the 20th century. The Civil War certainly has the effect of decreasing even more our faith in institutions. It starts to make us skeptical that institutions are actually going to serve us and do what they're supposed to do. The institutions around them start to fall apart, and so they become more skeptical. And then through Reconstruction, they're putting things back together. So we eventually, end up at 1961 to jump us way into the future, which on May 12th of that year, the Unitarians and the Universalists officially merge. Um, so they get together. In a lot of ways, they found that they had compatible theologies. They also were experiencing similar trends in terms of their membership and their finances, and they thought it made sense for them to merge. My understanding is the youth group, actually, the youth services merged first, and so the children, I see some nodding heads, so I think I'm remembering that correctly. The youth merged first, and then eventually the churches themselves merged together, and we became Unitarian Universalists. So I want to think the last part of this sort of talking together before we get to the piece where we're going to do some breakout rooms. What do we inherit from these big traditions? And I've come up with a list of 7 things that I think are the highlights of what we inherit as UUs from our Unitarian and Universalist background. So first, and maybe primarily, we inherit a liberal approach to religion that draws on traditional sources of religious wisdom, but emphasizes human reason as experience as equally valid sources. So we have not thrown out traditional sources of wisdom, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, but we bring to those things a critical mind, and our human experiences as equally valid sources of spirituality and inspiration. The second thing I think that we bring from both of those religions is a really bookish academic approach to religion and spirituality in the world. That comes more out of our Unitarian heritage. The Unitarians tended to be much more middle to upper class. They tended to be more college educated. The Universalists tended to be more from rural communities, and just statistically less well educated. Um, that doesn't mean that that their theologies were sort of less intricate or intelligent, just that as a the demographic was not as well didn't have the formal education. But from that tradition, we are definitely a brainy group, Um, Sometimes I've heard this from several people now, the joke that Unitarian Universalism is where the word made flesh goes to become word again, that we like our words. Third thing I think we get is the centrality of love and a rejection of sin and hell and any kind of, eternally punished or fallen nature. And that's really from our universalist tradition, this idea that love is at the center, which, in this recent discussion and voting on the values was something that was kind of controversial in a lot of ways and new for many people, but really is part of it's the heart, no pun intended, of who we were and who we come from. That God is love and love should be at the center of all we do is really us the core of universalist teaching. Fourth thing we get is a deeply rooted sense of social justice and equality and a belief that all of nature is sacred. So this idea that we are all equally sacred as humans, but also that we are part of that interconnected web and it's all sacred. Therefore, we have to act like we believe that. And that leads us to be on the forefront of many, certainly of the 19th and 20th century social justice movements. That does not mean that we got it all right and that there aren't some sort of very horrible and shameful parts of our history. But generally, we are closer to um, the forefront of a lot of those movements. As I said, I think we get, fifthly, a fierce and sometimes detrimental sense of individualism. I think currently we are trying to figure out how to be a tradition, and not sort of individuals who happen to come together and spend time together but believe different things. I've experienced, at least in the last 5 to maybe 10 years, a shift from the approach of like, oh, we just believe whatever we want and then we get together on Sunday, to, oh, we really are a tradition and we do believe things in common. And that we're not just individuals. Community is important. Sixthly, we get from both of these traditions our sense of congregational polity, which is our fancy way of talking about how we organize as churches. Unlike some other churches, like the Episcopalians and the Catholics, who have dioceses, or some of the other Protestant churches that have regions and bishops, we don't have that. Each congregation is its own authority, and the congregation is at the top of an inverted pyramid in terms of the power structure. And with some very few requirements to be part of the association, the UUA, we are other than those few requirements, we are free to sort of organize ourselves and emphasize what we want to believe, and figure out how we want to govern ourselves, congregation to congregation. And then seventh, and I added this one today as I was looking at the list. I think we get from both of these traditions being a little cantankerous. Like they were kind of curmudgeons because they were deep thinkers and they were people who questioned authority. They were people who did not just believe um, what their ancestors had told them, and they certainly did not just go along to go along. And we get that too, I think. And that, as most things, is a double-edged sword. I think we are very deep thinkers. We want to make sure we actually believe what we say we believe and that we're acting on it. And sometimes that can make it hard to be in community, um, or at least we have to figure out how we want to be in community with each other when we are all very, strong-willed people. So I'm gonna pause us there because now we're gonna think about some more modern theologies. And I'm gonna take a break from screen sharing, mostly so that I can set up the breakout rooms. Oh, I see in the chat there is a article from the New York Times. And let me set the breakout room. So there's how many of us? 22. Sign automatically. Let's do 5. I'm going to do 8 breakout rooms. So that'll give 2 to 3 people per room, knowing that some of us have a couple people in their window. So if you get to your breakout room, a few words about that first. So first, when I send you there, um, there's no pressure to answer any of these questions or to say any more than you want to. They're not super like, private questions, but they are questions about belief and some personal history, maybe. I don't think it's anything too terribly private, as I said, but feel free to pass if you want to. There are no designated leaders in the group, so I trust all of us to be a little self-aware enough. Sorry, that's my mother-in-law calling my husband to her room. She needs help. You can hear that in the background. Um, and so when you get there, if somebody, be self-aware enough to know that you're don't talk too much or encourage everybody to get a chance to share. And as we go through different questions of the night, if you said a lot the last time, maybe let somebody else start the next time. I think that's all I need to say in terms of breakout room etiquette. So let's continue. So we'll talk a little bit about each of the theologies that I think you are likely to encounter at first UU. So we just got done talking about sort of our common history. Now I'm thinking particularly in this one, what are the theologies um, of First UU San Diego? But also I think we tend to be pretty these are pretty common beliefs within certainly Southern California, but sort of West Coast Unitarianism. So first is sort of the big overview. We just went through this shift in how we publicly talk about our beliefs. We do that in Article 2. So I know there's some new people here. You may hear um, If you're new to Unitarian Universalism, you might hear people throw around this word Article 2. That refers to Article 2 of our bylaws, because we do not have any other sacred texts where we point to as sort of authoritarian sources of belief. So we define what we believe in our bylaws. It's also what we believe commonly. And so while these are sort of a way of explaining what we believe, there's nowhere does it say that like this is the only way you can explain what you use believe. Um, you know, just because we've changed the bylaws from talking about principles and sources to now talking about values and covenant, that doesn't mean that like we've thrown the principles out and we don't believe those anymore. It just means we've changed the way we talk about what we believe to the sort of the front of the house, in our forward-facing documents. This is how we describe our beliefs. So, up until this year, you may have heard people talk a lot about the principles, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. You can read the rest of them. They're there on the left in the sort of rainbow flag part. Each of those is the principles. The one in purple is the eighth principle, which we at First UU had adopted several years back, but not all congregations had adopted. And then at this very last GA, we voted to change the way we talk about it to this little, this is a different image than you see in Article 2. We use different imagery to sort of talk about these values, but that little sort of atomic symbol over there to the bottom right has love as our central value, and then around it, six other values that we think are core to what we believe, and they would be generosity, transformation, equity, pluralism, interdependence, and justice. And one way we teach, especially the little kids, to remember those is the mnemonic JETPIG. So if you're stumbling, JETPIG. And we have lots of little pictures of little piggies with jetpacks sort of tootling around through space. Um, and so that's a way you can believe that or remember what it is we say we believe. So, thinking about the theological um, flavors you might encounter if you walked into First UU. So, the first way I think I would explain what you might see to a newcomer is that we are an Abrahamic adjacent people. So, the Abrahamic traditions are Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And you might encounter at First UU people who have either a history with or a current belief in one or more of these Abrahamic traditions. You will also find people um, who resonate spiritually with these traditions, but don't necessarily believe them literally. So I'll speak from my own experience. I grew up Catholic and was in Roman Catholic seminary for a while. Um, I do not believe sort of the Christian story anymore. Like I don't believe it's factually true and don't necessarily I'm not a practicing Christian, but it's in my bones somewhere, right? Like I hear some of those stories. I still think sometimes in terms of those metaphors and those myths and those stories. And those they still hold meaning somewhere for me. And I say that they hold meaning for me in the same way that I sometimes find The Lord of the Rings meaningful, or I sometimes find a work of art or a song or a poem meaningful. They're just part of my sort of broad cloth of spirituality. However, if you look at our year, so if you looked at our worship calendar, you're going to see a lot of holidays throughout the year that are that are part of these traditions. So we celebrate Christmas. We have a big thing on Christmas Eve. We celebrate Easter. We don't celebrate them in the same way as some other those Christian traditions might, but we celebrate them. Um, we have a High Holy Days service every year. We recently just had a Hanukkah celebration um, with a new group led by Rabbi Alexis Pierce, who is meeting on our campus. Really thrilled to have her. So they led a Hanukkah celebration. I just got done talking with one of their members. We're planning to sort of team up on a Purim celebration, which is another Jewish holiday. We will probably have a Seder later on in the spring. So you'll see these traditions, and they sort of spring up in our hymns. The metaphors are there. Certainly, our service is vaguely structured the way a Protestant Christian service would be. We call it the sermon sandwich, right? You come in, we do some readings, we sing some songs, and then the sermon is sort of the main event around which the rest of the service sort of is structured, and then we sing some more songs and we leave. And that's a very sort of Protestant Christian way of doing it. So these Abrahamic religions show up a lot in our theology. So first round of breakout rooms, when I send you there, you may want to jot these down. Um, you can answer any or both of these questions or neither if another question sparks your interest. The whole point of this is to have discussion. So, are there parts of these traditions that you personally find meaningful or aspects of them that are part of your life? If not, what questions or wonders do you have about how these traditions show up in UU spaces? So this is a chance to talk about, what parts of these traditions do you find meaningful, if any? Do you celebrate any of these holidays? Maybe you have trouble with these traditions. It's okay to talk about that too. We get a lot of come-inners who come to us because they have had horrible experiences with some of these traditions. That's totally okay to talk about as well. Or if not, and especially if you're newer and you're not coming out of one of these traditions, this might be an opportunity to ask some of the folks in the room, um, what how they show up, what's their experience with these NUU traditions. So I'm gonna send us into breakout rooms. I'm gonna give us, we'll start with 5 minutes for this one. I'll call us back, and then we'll check in and see if that felt like enough time or too much time. And off we go. Breakout room should be open. I see lots of smiles as people come back, which is always a good sign. That's good. Can we do a little? I used to do this with the kids, just with our thumbs. This would mean it was perfect. This means like it went okay, or this means like I need more time. How many people felt like they had enough time? I see some no's, some no. It's all or oh well, okay. So I will give us some more time. I'm gonna recreate the rooms because
Tony, we only had two people in our room. Is that how many?
well, some of them had two, some of them had three, but some of them also had like three people, but two people in a box. So that's a little tricky.
Okay.
I'm gonna do it with, I'm gonna do 6 rooms this time, and I'm gonna look to see how things like I'm gonna move them to 6. Sorry, I'm talking to myself. There we go. Okay, this should make it a slightly more even this time. So, in addition to the Abrahamic traditions, you will also find humanism in a UU church, specifically our UU church. So, a humanism is the belief that the existence of God or a divine being doesn't matter much. So humanists get the um, maybe sometimes get painted as always agnostic or atheist. That is generally true, but not always. You can have a spiritual humanist. I consider myself a spiritually agnostic humanist, and so I don't really care much about whether God exists because I think the question is just, I wouldn't change the way I live if I found out tomorrow that God actually existed. I think I'm living my life the best I can anyway. And so, you know, whether or not God existed wouldn't change much of what I do. Instead, I focus on what humans can experience or humanists focus on what humans can experience, what are the common human needs, and how to achieve what's good or moral or ethical through rational means. So, there are some, I think, certainly with the first UU, you would encounter some humanists who are staunch atheists, and that's okay. And yet they still worship with us. Some, like myself, would be agnostic, and others would say, like, I tend to think there might be a God or gods, but I don't really know. And, ultimately, that's not really an important question for me. And so you encounter that certainly within our church. And um, I think I've seen a change, I would say, in my time. I've been working at First UU San Diego for about 9 years now. And I think when I first started there, I would say that that humanism was like the main flavor. If I was sort of thinking about our ice cream sundae of a congregation, the humanists would have been like the main attraction. And that's started to shift a little bit. I think some of the younger people coming in tend to be a little bit more, well, I don't know that they're necessarily more like believers or theists, but they're definitely more interested in a different kind of spirituality maybe than was my experience of new people back, you know, 9 or 10 years ago. But definitely still a large part of our congregation. So some questions to think about with regards to humanism. If somebody suggested that whether or not God exists doesn't matter, like what does that bring up for you hearing that idea? And on the other end, how comfortable are you with God language? Like if you're sitting in a service and you hear a hymn that says God or, creator or, um, we don't do the like Lord or Jesus very much at all, other than Christmas. But you'll hear God, you'll hear Spirit of life, you'll hear sort of God language. How comfortable are you with that? How comfortable are you with religious language? What comes up for you when you hear that? And you can even talk more generally about what is your sort of flavor of spirituality and how do you relate with the divine, if at all. So we're going to try breakout groups part two. We'll see if this works better. Based on the feedback, I'm going to give you 7 minutes this time and see if that works. So off we go. Oh, nobody came back early, so that's always a good thing. And I still see smiles, so good. It's a little more time helpful. Oh, good. Good.
Yeah.
Good. So we have three more rounds. So it feels like 7 minutes is probably going to be the magic number. If nothing else, we're going to run out of time if we don't do that.
Tony, could we ask you a question?
Sure.
The question is secular humanism.
Uh-huh.
Uh, First is what is it? Why secular? And how is secular humanism different
Yeah.
from just humanism?
Well, right. So there would be secular. The secula is just Latin for the world. And so the secular humanist is the humanist who is not necessarily connected to a religious tradition. They're just, out there in the world, sort of, person on the street, as opposed to maybe a spiritual humanist. It would be somebody like myself who is, generally, I think humanism is the best label I can give myself, but connected to a religious tradition, a religious humanist. Hopefully that answers the question. Um, the next big tradition, I'm not going to put the slide up because it's so short. There's not really much to see on the slide anyway. The next theology I think that you will see show up at First UU in San Diego is liberation theology. So this is a brand of started as a Christian tradition. especially in Central and South America. It's the belief that we cannot separate our physical liberation, or, in this life, from any kind of talk of spiritual liberation, or freedom from sin, or sort of spiritual freedom, either in some next life or on some spiritual realm. So it was really a reaction to, you know, uh, pretty hurtful, horrible situations of injustice in the world, where the church, especially the Catholic Church, seemed to, ignore the political and practical realities of the people in the world. And the tradition, I guess, that would say, well, it's okay. You're suffering in this life. Life is hard. Take up your cross, and everything will be okay in the next life. And liberation theology is a response to that, that says, nah, that's not making sense. We're not going to like put off salvation to some future, maybe or maybe not, life. Next life, we are going to be very focused on freeing the individual in this life. And I think this shows up not so much as a theology per se at First UU, but we have a very strong tradition of being social justice minded people. And we are very proud, I think, of our social justice action, both in the past and present. So, I think it comes up a lot in my conversations at First UU when I talk about who we are as a congregation, our social justice stance, whether we're talking about, being on the forefront of same-sex marriage, or gender equality, or talking about the amazing success of our food pantry, going from a shelf of peanut butter to feeding 500 families every week. That doesn't count the diaper pantry on Saturday. Really sort of amazing things that we do. And so your question for discussion is, what social justice issues are you passionate about? What stuff that really just, gets you fired up in terms of social justice? And the second question, if time allows, if someone asked you why we do social justice as a church, as opposed to just going off and doing it as an individuals, how might you respond? Like, how is it different to do these social justice projects as a faith community? All right, I'm going to send you out into breakout rooms. If those worked pretty well, I'm gonna just do the repeat for this round, and then I'll switch it up again next time. So sending you off to those same rooms again, and see you in 7 minutes. Kathy, who just joined us, I am gonna send you to breakout room 6, if that's okay, to talk about social justice. So you see a little thing jump up on your screen. If you click go to the breakout room, it'll take you to that room. Welcome back. Welcome back. All right, talking to myself as I recreate some different rooms for next time. Okay, that looks good. So another flavor of theology that you will encounter at First UU is earth-centered spirituality. Sometimes we say ECSC. We, in the recent past, had a very large and very active earth-centered spirituality circle. Several of those people have just moved on. Some of them moved out of state. Others have moved on to different, just different places in their lives. And so we don't have a formal earth-centered spirituality group currently, but earth-centered spirituality honestly has sort of become just part of what it is we do. Um, for those of you who remember Reverend Omega, who was with us for a while and is now at Friendship Church up north, she considered herself a spiritual naturalist. And several of those interim ministers who were with us, I'm thinking of Suzelle Lynch particularly, was also a spiritual naturalist and a pagan. And so that it sort of became just part of who we are. And, we will celebrate um, some of those holidays. Yule is kind of part of what we do. Again, we don't have that big Yule service like we did anymore, but it's part of our liturgical calendar. Um, the solstices will be in there. And a lot of the ways that we talk about ourselves, again, especially over the past, I would say 5 or 6 years, I've heard the language of spiritual naturalism sort of become part of who we are. It is no surprise to me that Blue Boat Home is sort of our like a second anthem. I see some hearts. It's one that when we start singing it, like everybody is like full voiced singing that one. So when thinking about Earth Center, oh, and I should say that this could take the form of a formal paganism of one sort or another, or it could take the form of just, like I believe we are part of the interconnected web of all existence, and honor the natural world. Doesn't have to be a formal belief system to be considered Earth-centered, but it can also look like part of any of the Native American historical traditions, though we tend not to have as much of that present in our community at First UU. So thinking about Earth-centered spirituality, the questions for discussions, what natural settings, if any, do you find spiritual or meaningful or rejuvenating? Do you have a favorite outdoor space? And if you are a practitioner of any earth-centered spirituality practices, what are those and how do those show up in your personal spiritual life? So I will send you again out for a 7-minute breakout, and we should have just enough to do our last one when you come back. Pause. Didn't want to record our staring silently at each other, but I do want to sort of wrap up for the video. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope you got something out of that. Mostly, I hope the time to talk to each other was helpful. I find that we don't often talk about spiritual things together. And so one of the things I love about doing it this way is you get a chance to talk to each other. I know there are some people who are newer than others, so if you're interested, this is by no means a hard sell, but if you would really like to talk to our membership person, that is the link that will take you to our newcomers page, and there's a form there you can fill out with any questions you have that will get it to the right person. And you can always email me, and I'm typing. I can't type and talk. Do that right. I did. That's my email. All the staff are first name at firstuusandiego.org. And feel free to email me anytime with any questions or ways I might be able to help. So thank you all very much, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
You're
Thank you so
welcome.
much.
You're welcome. Have a great night.